Alright, so welcome to A Christmas Carol revision. We're going to be looking at Marley's Ghost in this session. Now, it's really important, and I'm just going to remind you that we are not just passively watching this, we are an active participant as you are revising this. We know the brain doesn't learn by just passively watching information. If you want to retain this information and if you actually want to learn it, you need to be active when you are doing it. So there's going to be times where I ask questions where you should pause the video and then answer those questions in your exercise books. Do not just watch this through. Instead, make notes, answer the questions. This is basically like just a normal lesson, except I'm on a screen and not in the classroom. So we're going to be looking at Marley's Ghost today. And he's my favourite ghost, in my opinion. I love the presentation of him across all of these different adaptations of A Christmas Carol. You can see how he's been depicted in various different forms. Now, my first question for you is as follows. 1. Who is Jacob Marley? What do you remember about him? What do you remember about his relationship to Scrooge? What do you remember about his presentation? And what I would do is I would write this question down and I would just bullet point everything that you remember about Marley's ghost currently, and then I'll talk about him, and then anything that you haven't written down you can add to your exercise books. So Marley, Jacob Marley, not Bob Marley that many people, especially in my classes, seem to get confused with. He is not a really famous reggae singer. Instead, he was Scrooge's former business partner. Scrooge sorted out his funeral. We also learned that Scrooge was his sole friend and mourner. He was the only person that attended his funeral. And we know also that Marley was condemned to wander the earth as a punishment for his miserly life. So, when Marley does return as a ghost, we know that it's as a result of his actions in his life. And he was a miser. And what we mean by that word is that essentially he was really, really focused on money. His only concern was business and wealth. He didn't care about people. And he also returns to warn Scrooge to avoid the same fate. And essentially Marley acts as the catalyst for Scrooge's redemption, because he warns him about the three ghosts and the three main apparitions that will visit Scrooge, that will allow Scrooge to change and sort of show him the errors of his ways. Now, the first question I want to ask is, why in the Exposition does Dickens choose to really establish and really emphasize that Marley is dead? Because you need to remember one thing, especially if you're aiming for top marks. Everything that Dickens has done, he's done for a reason. So he's chosen, on the first page of A Christmas Carol, to emphasize and repeatedly reiterate the fact that Marley is dead. That there's no doubt about it. Now, what you could do is you could pause the video here, have a quick scan of the extract on the right, and then answer that question. Why do you think, on the first page, structurally, Dickens has chosen to present Marley's death? Now, once you've answered that question, here's my thoughts on it. So the first thing to note is that Dickens repeatedly emphasizes and reiterates that Marley is dead. He says, Marley was dead to begin with. It's literally the first sentence of A Christmas Carol. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Now, the reason he does this, in my opinion, is when Marley's ghost appears, one, it emphasizes his supernatural nature. The readers are not confused about the fact that Marley appears as a ghost. It really emphasizes the fact that, well, Marley's dead, Scrooge attended his funeral, so when he returns, it is in a supernatural form. Secondly, Dickens anchors the entire story of A Christmas Carol on Marley's death. And this is really significant because on your first page of A Christmas Carol, you are anchoring the entire plot on the fact that Marley, Scrooge's ex-business partner, is dead. Now, as we're going to explore later, Scrooge and Marley parallel each other as characters. So what it does is it foreshadows Scrooge's potential fate if he doesn't change his ways, and it ties into Jacob Marley's function as a character. Now, in terms of AO3, your third assessment objective, it's essentially about the context of the text. Now, during the Victorian era in which this text was written, there was massive supernatural significance. The Victorians were very superstitious in their thinking, and they were obsessed with ghost stories. like one of my favorite books ever is called The Turn of the Screw, and it's written by Henry James, and it follows a very similar format. It's at Christmas Eve, and it's a group of people gathered around a fire and they're telling ghost stories. Like, this was sort of a tradition in the Victorian era. They loved the supernatural, and they were really obsessed with superstitious ideas. Now, another contextual point to remember is that this text was originally meant to be a pamphlet, so it was meant to be like a leaflet where Dickens talks about the effects of poverty and the struggles of the poor. But instead he chose and decided to write a novella. So he could have written a non-fiction article, and Charles Dickens wrote loads. There's loads of non-fiction articles that Charles Dickens wrote. But instead he was really clever, and he was like, actually, let me appeal to the imagination of my audience. And the Victorian people at the time, you know, his message is still conveyed in a very effective way, but instead he chose to do it in a fictional format to appeal to their imagination, hoping that they would digest this story and then learn the lessons and the moral in A Christmas Carol. And it's important to, you know, these small bits of context. You're not writing a history essay when you do your exam, but knowing these bits of context and knowing when to embed them throughout your paragraphs, you know, it shows the examiner that you've read widely, that you understand the significance of the supernatural, that you understand the purpose of A Christmas Carol. So when you're noting down this information, don't forget to use it. Like, in your essays, make sure that you're using this information to support your argument about Dickens's message. Now, the first significant thing to note about Marley is the symbolism of chains. Now, you can see here that I've specifically used the terms the metaphor and symbolism of chains. And what I would do now is I would pause the video again, read through this short extract, and just bullet point, what do you think the chains are symbolic of? What do you think they're a metaphor of? But also, why is it that Dickens is really emphasizing the fact that Jacob Marley made the chain in his own life by his free will? So I would answer those two questions, and then I will explain my thoughts on it, and then you can add to your notes based off what I say. Now, the first thing to mention is that Marley establishes, I wear the chains I forged in life, and that he made it link by link and yard by yard of his own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Those that are in my class, you know, I'm obsessed with psychology, and I think this psychologically is so interesting. And Dickens is so clever in the way he's presented this, because behaviourally, when you understand that something is a conscious choice and a conscious decision, one, you're more likely to change that behaviour because you have an awareness of it. But two, I think it emphasises for Scrooge the fact that actually I'm making a decision to act in the way that I'm acting with my wealth and the way that I'm acting with people. And therefore, by shining a light on that conscious decision-making process, it allows Scrooge to then start to reflect with the aid of the other ghosts, to reflect and then change that behaviour. So psychologically, it's significant, the fact that he's saying, you know, you have free will. You've decided to act in this way, so then you will bear the punishment and the consequences for your decisions. Not only this, I would also add on, and I would say the fact that he's emphasizing the fact that he chose to behave in this way and he made the chain himself. It kind of establishes the theme of responsibility, the fact that you're responsible for the way that you handle your money and also the way that you're acting in your life. And as a result of that responsibility, you will then bear the consequences for that. And you can see what Marley says to Scrooge here. He says, essentially about Scrooge's chains, it was as full, as heavy, and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain. And you can see Scrooge's reaction to the chains is kind of trembling more and more. So the symbolism and metaphor of the chains is they're symbolic and metaphorical for actions, deeds, and punishment. And you can see Marley inspiring Scrooge with fear here. He's saying, the chains that I'm wearing were equivalent to yours 7 Christmas Eves ago. In other words, your chains now are probably way heavier and a lot worse than mine. And he emphasizes this by saying it's a ponderous chain. And again, emphasizing that responsibility by saying you've labored on it. So the next question I would kind of ask that you could answer would be, why would Marley do this? Why do you think Dickens is how is Scrooge characterized through Marley's presentation here? What do we learn about Scrooge through the reflection of Marley talking about his ponderous chain? And it becomes clear that if Marley was someone who was a miser, who wasn't concerned with humanity but instead was concerned with his own wealth, if Scrooge's chain was like Marley's 7 Christmas Eves ago, we can see that Scrooge is almost like a worse version of Marley. The fact that his chain is heavier, that he's continued to labour upon it, it's setting up Scrooge's potential fate and his condemnation later on. Now, the next significant thing to talk about is Marley's function. And I think this is something that higher level students will do naturally, and I don't even know if they're conscious of the fact that they're doing it, but definitely, you know, in order to attain high marks for literature, everyone needs to understand, and this is like a shift you have to make. Characters are not real. Scrooge is not a real person, so when you're writing about him in an essay, a sophisticated essay anyway, you're not going to be talking about Scrooge as if he's a real person. You're not going to be talking about Marley as if he's a real person. Instead, Dickens literally sat there when he was planning A Christmas Carol. He was probably brainstorming, right, what do I want this character to achieve? What is the function of this character? So the question I would ask you, and I've put an extract here to sort of guide your thinking, is what is Marley's function? Why did Dickens include him in the text in the first place? What's his purpose as a character? And once you've answered that question, I want to emphasize the importance of talking about the function of characters. This is something that I always talk about in lessons, but your characters have a purpose and the characters have functions, and always mention that when you're writing about them. Now, Marley's function, I don't think it's that complicated. It's actually pretty clear. He functions as a warning. You know, he provides Scrooge with multiple warnings, the first being of the apparitions that appear to him. So he catalyzes the plot and the action of A Christmas Carol. But on top of that, we can see his function is to remind Scrooge and emphasize the entire message of A Christmas Carol. So Scrooge says, "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob." Now, when Scrooge is saying that, he's obviously referring to financial business, economic success. But then the ghost has quite a extreme reaction to this. He cries out business and sort of shakes his chains, and then he says, "Mankind was my business, the common welfare was my business, charity, mercy, forbearance and benevolence were all my business." And this shows Marley's function. It's to remind the reader, one, but two, to remind Scrooge that life isn't about hoarding finances and considering the economic landscape of the Victorian era. The message is really clear, that we need to look out for each other, that we need to help the poor, and we need to concern ourselves with helping humanity and just being good people, which kind of ties into the theme of Christmas as well, which is why he set it at this time. And I love this metaphor. "The dealings of my trade were but a drop in the water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." And what I would do is I would take this quote, I would annotate it quickly independently before we talk about it. Now, the metaphor is really interesting because he describes his business as a drop of water in a comprehensive ocean, essentially suggesting that, you know, his business and money and his job were not significant, especially in the grand scheme of his life now that he's, you know, passed on and is dead and is a ghost. But they were really insignificant in comparison to looking out for others, for being a kind and merciful person, for sharing love through benevolence. That is the primary purpose of humanity, according to Dickens and according to Jacob Marley here. And it shows how Marley, like Scrooge, because they parallel each other, concern themselves with money, not understanding that looking out for others and being just a good person and concerning themselves with humanity and using their wealth for good, that is what is meaningful and significant in life. And the last thing, again, this is like a G9 skill, is connecting Marley in the opening to other moments in A Christmas Carol. And I think this is the connection that I would like to make. At the end of the text, when Scrooge has, undergone his transformation, is emerged over enthusiastically and over the top, giddy and happy, and characterized in a very positive, happily, I can't phrase that, almost like very emotional but excited and over the top, and very nice and kind and charitable. He says, and there's 3 similes here, but I've just chosen this one. The connection I'm drawing here, I mean, you can write it down in your books, but you can probably guess, is the chains, that ponderous chain that he laboured upon, he's now been relieved from it. He's emancipated himself from the heavy-duty, laboured chain that he created for the remainder of his life. And again, this is a G9 skill, being able to make the connection. And it's one thing to make the connection in your brain as you're talking about it, learning about it, making notes about it, but it's another thing to making sure that you're making those connections in your writing as well. So something to think about would be how you would structure a paragraph on this. You wouldn't start off with this quote. Instead, you would probably start off demonstrating the significance and symbolism of the chains, and then bringing this quote in at the end to show how Scrooge has emancipated himself from that. So overall, here's how I would revise for and learn Jacob Marley's character effectively. I've reduced it for you, but you can choose 4 different words or 5 different words, but reducing his character and his significance in the text to 4 or 5 words is really effective in retaining information and learning it. So I've chosen the word exposition, parallels, function, and responsibility. Now what I would do is, as a first task, is write these words down and then expand upon them. You can annotate them with all the information that you remember, or you can do a piece of writing based on each of these, and what that will do is it will solidify that connection in your brain between that one word and all the information that you have to learn about Marley. 2, I would firstly write down and then analyze key quotations about Marley, which were on the extracts above, but you could also just go online and find, I'm sure, many. Or you can go through A Christmas Carol yourself at the ones you've highlighted, write them out, annotate them, analyze them, look at the significance of the language, look at the writer's methods used, but then always put the quote in the context of the whole text and the message of the text. Never analyze in isolation. Always take the quote and apply it to the whole meaning of the text. 3, I'm a massive advocate for flashcards. So writing out questions, for example, why does Dickens choose to open A Christmas Carol with Marley? And then on the back some notes, and test yourself and then verbally answer them. Or the 4th task that you could do is to write a diary entry from the perspective of Marley. What are his regrets? Why does he visit Scrooge? How might he feel after he speaks to him? Now you might be thinking, but sir, we're meant to write an essay on Marley, we're not, doing a piece of creative writing. You are correct. However, if we're thinking about memory, if we're thinking about retention, if we're thinking about learning, by doing that 4th task, you're really forcing yourself to think hard about the character of Marley. And it's only by thinking and exploring thoughts about Marley that it actually sticks with you and that you learn. So I would go ahead, choose maybe 2 or 3 of these tasks and go ahead and answer them in your books. Hopefully this was useful. The next one I'll probably talk about Ghost of Christmas Past. Best of luck. See you later.